And so what we're going to do today, though, is we're going to start on a whole new topic. And everything through Monday will be on tonight's exam. And what we're going to deal with today is the beginnings of the nervous system. And much of what we'll see in the nervous system is in many ways a derivative of what we saw in the endocrine system. It's just the communication is going to be a little closer between these cells rather than at long distances. But even in the nervous system, there are some paracrine effects. To lay out how the nervous system works, though, where I want to start is to think about the nervous system as a machine. How does it work simply in biological terms? This is a fairly novel idea. We really have come to the idea that the brain is the seat of consciousness only in the last 160 years or so. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some history where these ideas came from. And to my mind, there has been, in the last 100 and some years, a tremendous transformation in how we think about the brain, how we think about life. And this is something, to me, that's interesting philosophically, and I'll touch on that a little bit. To begin the ideas, though, we'll begin with this idea of a three-box model, just to simplify the complexity of the nervous system down to three boxes. Now recognize that typically a brain contains something in the order of 100 billion neurons. It contains perhaps 1,000 times that many synapses, which are the communication sites between the neurons. So to give you some idea of that there are something like 100 billion stars in the galaxy and something like 100 billion galaxies in the universe, just to use two more inexplicable numbers to illustrate the first. But what we want to do here is simplify this down to three boxes. Data in, which is going to be sensory, data analysis, integration, and data out, which is motor. So we're going to see this. When we look at this three-box model, this first set is really nothing more than what you would see from most computer scientists. If you talk to a computer scientist, they'll talk commonly in terms of data in, then you analyze the data inside the machine, and then you get an output. Well, this is really how the nervous system is working as well. And so we have sensory input coming in. We know what's going on in the world around us because of the sensory input. But the sensory input in itself doesn't tell us very much. We really have to integrate it and analyze it. That goes on in the central nervous system. That goes on in the brain and spinal cord. And then once we've integrated the information, once we can make some sense of the world around us, then we have to do something about it. This is known as the final common pathway. This is basically motor or movement. In some cases it can be in the autonomic nervous system, it may be releasing hormones, but nonetheless it's an output of some sort. Then we'll bring this round to a couple of terms that will be repeated over and over again. When we talk about the nervous system, we divide it into two big groups: the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. When we talk about the peripheral nervous system, what we're really talking about is anything outside of the brain and spinal cord. The brain and spinal cord define the central nervous system. Anything outside of that is considered to be the peripheral nervous system. And the information in the peripheral nervous system that's carrying information toward the brain and spinal cord are called afferents. This is going to be sensory. Now, I'm going to fib a little bit on this. If you take a neuroanatomy course or a functional neurobiology course, you'll find the definitions are a little different. They talk about special sensory afferents and such. But we're just going to think about the idea of things in the peripheral outside world being conveyed to the central nervous system. And this conveyance will be through a series of neurons which will lump into a group called afferents to carry toward. And then we'll see that once the information's been analyzed, it doesn't matter to us very much unless we can do something about it. And that's really movement. And movement is carried out by motor efferents. And so the motor efferents are basically innervation of skeletal muscle for the most part. Maybe smooth muscle, it may be endocrine glands, but it's still innervation of something in the periphery to bring about a change. And so what we'll see here then is sensory in, do some analysis, integration, and motor out. Well, the other point I want to make here, and we don't really have time to spend on much of the sensory nervous system, and if you really want to know more about how sensory nervous systems work, there are other courses to be taken on campus, but we'll just touch on this. But in the vein of thinking about the nervous system as a machine, there are a few ideas I want to go through. And the idea here is that when we think about sensory transduction, what this word transduction means is to change through. And the transduction mechanisms here are simply to convert one form of energy into another. And the conversion of one form of energy into another in our nervous systems is to change one form of energy into the movement of ions across membranes. This idea of having a potential across a membrane, having a kind of battery, using that potential energy to move ions through channels and down concentration gradients is really what the nervous system is all about. And so we'll spend a lot of time laying out those ideas. But in the end, whenever you think about how your nervous system is functioning, or if you think about how the nervous system of another organism is functioning, it's all about changing one form of energy to another, and the final energy is going to be the movement of ions across membranes. Everything we know about the world around us comes to us through three major changes in energy. There's going to be the one that we're most familiar with and cognizant of all the time is electromagnetic, and for us, that's light. We have a very narrow spectrum of the electromagnetic range that we're sensitive to. We call it light. And we'll find that that's part of the electromagnetic system. And I'll tell some stories about how other animals use different aspects of the electromagnetic system. The mechanical changes are probably some of the easiest to conceptualize, because you can imagine reaching out and touching something. You can realize that when you touch something, you can feel it. And you can recognize that in that first aspect of touch, there has to be a change in energy, and a simple way of changing the energy is to deform the nerve endings, to change their shape, and by changing their shape, change the movement of ions across those membranes. The third one here is chemical, and the way we interact with the world chemically is through mostly taste and smell. We're all aware of this. We don't think of this as an ability to interact with the world through chemistry, but in fact it is. It's probably the oldest of the senses. If you look at the anatomy of the olfactory system, and if you look at the way these chemical systems work, they're probably among the oldest. And the reason for that is, in order to survive, organisms had to find something to eat. And so one of the mechanisms, or the sensory mechanisms of finding something to eat, was to track down a sensory trail. To track down a trail of chemicals so that you could find the source and eat it. And so this is probably among the oldest of the senses, but all of these are important to us. Then, if there's time, we'll move on to the neuron doctrine. So we'll lay out this whole story in terms of big boxes and big themes. And then we'll come around and talk about the idea of the neuron as being the fundamental structural and functional unit of the nervous system. And this is an idea that only came about, in the last 100 years or so. And we'll spend a little time talking about where that came